Next, our speaker. Reeves Brown is a member of Building a Better Colorado, and that's what he's here to talk to us about today. Building a Better Colorado is a statewide coalition of businesses and nonprofit leaders. For the last several years, Building a Better Colorado has engaged community leaders across our state in conversations that explore public policy solutions to improve Colorado. Reeves will explain the motivation and process behind the Building a Better Colorado Coalition's unique model for engaging Coloradans in a statewide conversation to discover consensus policy recommendations. Carl Kurtz is my speechwriter and wanted me to call attention to the next to last bullet point on Reeves' bio that's on the screen. As someone who grew up working in and around cow manure, Reeves says that he is uniquely qualified to work in the public policy arena. Reeves, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take this out, and just so I can see my slides as they come up here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. I was able to speak to the Denver Downtown Rotary last week. Seth Patterson graciously hosted me there, and Seth said, have you talked to the Boulder Rotary yet? You haven't been anywhere until you've talked to the Boulder Rotary. So I really appreciate Carl inviting me up here. I'm going to take a few minutes and just kind of explain who Building a Better Colorado is, what our motivation is, and kind of what we did this year, and then hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience as well. So Building Better Colorado started in 2015, and the kind of the basis for us coming together is a concern about how Colorado over the last 35 years has really tied itself in a knot in terms of our Constitution through a series of amendments that we have made to our Constitution. This chart just shows eroding trust in government. I got this chart off from Pew Research Center. But no surprise here. The confidence in government and trust in government has been eroding for some time, more so at the national and to a lesser degree state level. But there is an erosion of confidence in that institution. And the public, over the last 35 years, Coloradans have used our initiative process, ballot initiative process, to respond to that eroding trust in government by making amendments to our state constitution that really have restricted our government's ability to govern. And all of those changes, all those amendments were made for good reason, with good intention, but it has created a problem. Up until 2016, Colorado had, by most measurements, the most easily amended state constitution in the nation, when you figure the process by which it is amended. And we had therefore seen more proposed ballot or constitutional amendments on our ballot, more initiatives than any state other than California and Oregon up to that point. And the initiative process was actually born out of the populist movement in the early 1900s in Oregon. So no surprise that Oregon and California led the way. What was interesting is that Colorado was number 3. This chart just shows the growth in the number of ballot initiatives just for Colorado, the statutory initiatives in the red and the constitutional proposed initiatives in the blue. And you can see up until the 80s, it wasn't real popular. But I think special interests discovered in the 80s that at least in Colorado with our process, it was less expensive just to put a bunch of money into a citizen initiative process to advance an agenda. It's cheaper to do that than to hire lobbyists to actually pass something in law. And the benefit was, if at that time it was just the same process for amending the state constitution as state law, so it was just as easy to amend the Constitution. And once it's in the Constitution, it's much harder to get out. So there was real motivation for special interests on all sides to pursue amendments to our Constitution, which they did quite successfully. And over the last 35 years, we've placed 3 fiscal policies into our state constitution. We actually have 4 fiscal policies in our Constitution. The first one was in 1876 at statehood, and that was the balanced budget requirement, right? Some people have suggested we should have stopped there, but we didn't stop there. In 1982, we adopted the Gallagher Amendment to our state constitution, which was the first fiscal policy that we put in, and that froze the ratio of total residential value in the state to total non-residential value in the state, and that affects the property tax base that pays for all local services. 10 years after that, we adopted the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, TABOR, in 1992, which limits the amount of revenue that state and local government can collect and invest in public service and infrastructure, and it requires a vote of the people to raise a tax. 8 years after that, we adopted Amendment 23 into our state constitution in 2000, and that is a minimum funding mandate for K through 12. The problem with putting fiscal policy into a state constitution is that when you put it in the Constitution, it's frozen in time. It doesn't change over time unless we change it, which is very difficult. And we cannot, with all our good intentions, we cannot foresee the future when we put fiscal policy into our Constitution. One of the things that we couldn't see back in the 80s was how Colorado's population would grow. This chart shows growth in population up to 1980. And if you were here then, you know we saw some fairly significant population growth in the 70s. Colorado had kind of been discovered as an international ski destination, and John Denver was singing our praises, and we thought that was kind of an anomaly, and it turns out it wasn't an anomaly. Colorado had been discovered, except for a brief respite when the oil bust of the 80s. We've seen significant population growth for 40 years, and that was something we just could not have foreseen when we adopted Gallagher in 1982, and that has impacted how that amendment has worked. Additionally, what we couldn't see when we adopted Gallagher in 82 and Tabor in 92 was how quickly our population in Colorado would age. The fastest growing demographic in Colorado is our senior crowd, 65 and over. Up until 2005, 1 in 5 Coloradans was 65 or over. And we started seeing a fairly significant increase in the aging of our population in the early teens. All those ski bums that moved here in the 70s that listened to John Denver, right? They never left. And you're still here, and now you want health care. And we don't expect this to level off till 2050. We are one of the fastest aging populations in the country. And there's no way we could have anticipated. By the time we peak here in 2050, 1 in 5 Coloradans will be a senior, double the percent of our population as it was 15 years ago. That affects fiscal policy. And this, too, we couldn't have foreseen when we put this in. So that's the danger in cementing fiscal policies into your state constitution, such as we've done. Because those policies don't change, although times do, and that creates unintended consequences. Additionally, we've overlaid these policies with each other in the Constitution, and they interact in ways that we never could have anticipated when we first adopted Gallagher in 1982. So it has created some challenges for our state fiscally, and I'm just going to share a couple of slides with you about metrics, fiscal metrics. This shows the state support in the blue, state support for higher education going back to 2000. In 2000, the state contributed 68% of in-state college tuition. In Colorado, today it's 35%. And so the burden for funding higher education tuition has shifted to students in the red. 20 years ago, the students paid 32%. Today, the students pay 68%. And so that means students are graduating with a lot more debt than they used to, which means they are less capable of purchasing a home when they graduate. So, which is great if you want a rental property, but it's not so great for the economy and real estate investment. Additionally, this slide just shows kind of where Colorado, what we've done in terms of K through 12 investment. This green line, and you may have seen this chart before, the green line represents the national average of annual per pupil investment by states. Up until the mid-'80s, Colorado invested at or even a little above the national average, and in the late '80s we started to decline. Today, Colorado invests about $2,800 below the national average in per pupil annual K through 12 investment. Transportation, over the last almost 30 years, since 1991, Colorado's population has grown 64%. The number of vehicle miles by that growing population has grown 82%. and yet the lane capacity to support that growing population has only grown 2%. And so if you feel like there's more people on the road than there was 20 years ago, you're not crazy. Well, you might be crazy, but you're not wrong. The per capita investment that we make as a state since 1991 has dropped almost by half when you adjust it for inflation. In 1991, we invested $125 per person in transportation infrastructure. Today, it's $69 because the primary mechanism for funding transportation is gas tax, which your legislature used to be able to raise from time to time to accommodate inflation. But once we adopted Tabor, it didn't allow for that anymore without a statewide vote. And so that gas tax is frozen in time at 1991 levels. And so that is really kind of the backdrop for why Building a Better Colorado came together in 2015. We believe we have the best form of government on the planet in our republic form of government. But no form of government is perfect, right? And one of the inherent challenges in a democracy of any kind, or a representative democracy such as we have, is it only works to the extent that the electorate participates. And to the extent that the electorate is educated and informed and in making informed decisions. And that is increasingly not happening. The electorate more and more is participating less and less in a face-to-face discussion and more with an anonymous screen, which makes it very easy to oversimplify issue and demonize people when you don't actually have to engage. And our electorate is increasingly about as informed as anybody can be in 160 characters. And so the advent of social media and the internet has, while it has done great things, it has really challenged the foundation on which our representative democracy is built. And additionally, there's two inherent challenges that really kind of stand in the way or constrict our ability to come together. Number one, our representative democracy rewards the loudest voices in the public policy debate, as it should. But sometimes the loudest voices don't represent the majority opinion. Sometimes they don't even represent an intelligent opinion, but they're really loud. And they're on all sides of the political spectrum. And they consume a disproportionate amount of oxygen in the public policy debate, and they have disproportionate influence in driving the outcome of public policy. Additionally, in our two-party system, and again, we think we have the best form of government on the planet, but a two-party system is not designed to bring us together as Coloradans so that we can engage in constructive discussion to find common sense solutions. That is not what a two-party system is for. A two-party system is built to accentuate our differences so that I can win and you can lose, or vice versa, right? It's a zero-sum game in a two-party system. There's no prize for second place. And so what we wind up with is something that looks less like collaborative dialogue for the common good and looks more like pushing one agenda or another as that pendulum swings back and forth every election cycle or two. And that really is what formed the backdrop for Building a Better Colorado to come together in 2015. BBCO is a group of statewide civic leaders that share a collective frustration at the apparent increasing inability of our traditional political process to bring Coloradans together, and a shared belief that the pathway to a better Colorado really lies in engaging civic leaders across the state in a constructive conversation about what they want their state to be. Foundational to our model is a series of community meetings that we have had. And in those community meetings, they're not public meetings. Our experience with public meetings is sometimes, not necessarily in Boulder, Colorado, but everywhere else in Colorado, public meetings oftentimes have more to do with competing political ideologies and organizational agendas and less about constructive discussion. And so in our community meetings, we work with established community leaders to build an audience that represents constructive voices that collectively look like the community. And engage them in a discussion about what we want our state to be. A second platform of our model is that we don't advocate one way or the other on the issues that we're teeing up for discussion. All we do is advocate for an honest conversation. So we present the facts of here's where we are today, here's where we've come from, what do you think we should do? So it's very empowering. We use those remote voting devices for people to tell us their opinion as to what, if anything, we should do differently as a state. And so that's what we are doing, is engaging the state in a statewide conversation, but equally important, again, to talk about what we're not doing. What we're not doing is advocating for an outcome. We're not even advocating for change. We're just advocating for an honest conversation, and people understandably want to know who's behind the curtain. If you follow the money, you'll find the agenda, right? And we're no different. We are very blessed to have the generous support of a number of statewide foundations, the Anschutz Foundation, Betcher Foundation, Bohemian Foundation, Buell Foundation, Caring for Colorado Foundation, Gates Family Foundation, Mile High United Way, and the Piton Foundation. These entities, like BBCO, are 501c3 nonprofit entities. They don't have a policy dog in this fight either. They, like us, are simply interested in an honest conversation amongst Colorado thought leaders about what we want our state to be and where we want to go. So we started this in 2015, and when we started it, it wasn't even supposed to be an organization. It was supposed to be just an experiment. We weren't even going to file the paperwork for an organization because we were going to be done in 6 months, but then we thought, well, we might as well file the paperwork in case it takes longer than 6 months. And here we are 5 years later. But the experiment was based on our belief that in every community of Colorado, rural community, small town, big city, county, doesn't matter. In every community, there are certain personalities that wield disproportionate influence over public opinion. Because of their personality or their title or their resources or their social media Rolodex or whatever, there are certain people in every community that have bigger influence on public opinion. And our experiment was, could we find a methodical way to go into any community, into Boulder or Aurora or Craig or Durango? Could we find a way to identify who are those people? And if you could identify them, could you get them to come together and engage for a couple hours in an honest conversation about state policy? And if they truly represented the diversity of a community, would they agree on anything? And if they did agree on anything, would the agreement of a group of civic leaders in one community like Boulder look anything like the agreement of a group of civic leaders in a very different looking community like Colorado Springs? So in 2015, we hosted 30 community meetings around the state. We engaged about 1,200 civic leaders that were identified. We looked at about 60 different policy ideas concerning 3 different areas: how we amend our state constitution, how we participate in elections, and then the state revenue limit. There were 5 consensus policy ideas that grew out of that where there was agreement from Sterling to Durango, from Craig to Lamar, and we published that report in February of 2016, and we thought we were done. The first idea that came out of that was, again, we had up to that point the most easily amended state constitution in the nation, and the recommendation from that statewide conversation was it shouldn't be hard to amend Colorado's constitution, but it shouldn't be the easiest one in the nation. And it ought to be more inclusive. You shouldn't be able to collect 100,000 signatures on the 16th Street Mall in Denver and have it appear on a ballot in Durango or Craig. You actually, if you're proposing to amend our foundational document, you actually ought to have to go out and talk to Coloradans about the merits of that idea, even to qualify for the ballot. And so subsequent to us publishing that recommendation, a separate campaign took that to your ballot in 2016. A majority of Coloradans voted for that. That is now state policy. A second recommendation, there were 2 recommendations regarding our election process. The first one concerning how unaffiliated voters participate. Unaffiliated voters are the largest block of voters in the state, and they are the fastest growing block of voters in the state. And up until 2016, they couldn't participate in the primary election unless they affiliated with a party, and then unaffiliated. And the recommendation from the 2015 conversation was unaffiliated voters shouldn't have to take extra steps to participate. They ought to be able to participate in the primary of their choice. And subsequent to us publishing that recommendation, a separate campaign took that to your ballot in 2016. A majority of you voted for that. That is now state policy. A third idea is that we should reinstate a presidential primary. Up to that point, for the 30 years prior, Colorado participated in the presidential primary by having the 2 major parties host a straw poll at their respective state conventions. And the recommendation from our 2015 conversation was we ought to bring back a presidential primary and give every Coloradan the opportunity to check the box beside the presidential candidate of their choice, and that might encourage more participation in our democracy. And so subsequent to us publishing that, a separate campaign took that to your ballot in 2016. A majority of you voted for that. That's now state policy. The last 2 ideas concerned fiscal policy, one of which was something called a hospital provider fee, which hospitals charge patients this fee to create a small pot of money which the state can then leverage against federal Medicaid dollars to draw down $9 for every dollar the hospitals raise to create a larger pot of money to provide preventative care for vulnerable populations. And it worked very well, this partnership between state and the medical community, except that revenue was counting towards the state's revenue limit, which was forcing your state to cut higher ed, which was really weird. And the recommendation from the 2015 conversation was the fee that hospitals charge patients for that hospital provider fee should not count towards the state's revenue limit. It's not a statewide tax. And your legislature subsequently adopted that recommendation in 2017. And the last consensus idea was that we should have a 10-year timeout of the state's revenue limit, the Tabor revenue limit, much as what we voted for in 2005 when we adopted Referendum C. That was a 5-year timeout. That is the only one of the 5 recommendations that actually didn't move forward. So in summary, every one of the 4 recommendations that moved forward is now state policy, either through the independent efforts of a private ballot initiative or through the actions of your state legislature. And that fairly well definitively answered in our mind the merits of this little 6-month experiment. And it convinced us of 2 things. Number one, it convinced us that if you identify thought leaders in communities and engage them in a constructive conversation which empowers them to drive the outcome and make the decision, regardless of their political affiliation or their skin color or their age or their gender or their profession, they will agree more than they disagree when they're looking at an issue through the shared lens of the state we love as opposed to a political ideology or an organizational agenda. And the second thing we learned is to the extent that community leaders across the state can agree on something, they have a whole lot of moxie that they can leverage in their community to influence others and statewide to actually implement their ideas. And so we did that again this year. We hosted 37 meetings across the state this year. We engaged a little under 1,800 community leaders through 111 meetings, drove a little over 20,000 miles. We had 2 breakdowns. We lost a tire on the top of Vail Pass and an alternator on Wadsworth Boulevard. But it's for 6 months we engaged people in a statewide conversation, and we talked about these 3 fiscal policies that we've embedded in the Constitution. I don't know if you can see that or not. Not really. These are pins that show where the meetings are. And obviously it was population proportionate along the Front Range, but trying to provide an opportunity for everybody in the state to participate in this. And again, we talked about the Gallagher Amendment that we adopted in 1982. We talked about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that we adopted in 1992, and we talked about Amendment 23 that we adopted in 2000. And the reason that we're talking about these fiscal policies is because they are the 3 fiscal constraints that we have embedded into our Constitution over the last 35 years, and they affect your quality of life, however you define your quality of life, whether it's the amount of time you spend with your family versus the amount of time you spend commuting to work, or the quality of your kid's K through 12 education, or the ability of your kid to go to college, or the quality of your next doctor, or the amount of money left in your pocket after taxes. However you define your quality of life, these 3 fiscal formulas that we've put in our Constitution affect that quality of life. And it's important to recognize that if you don't like how they're affecting your quality of life, only you can fix it, right? Your legislature can't amend the Constitution. Only the people can. And so that's why we are talking to the people of Colorado about this. And it's important also to recognize that all 3 of these amendments were put into our Constitution with good intention. Coloradans don't vote against their own self-interest, not intentionally. But because we've put these policies into a static Constitution and we live in a dynamic world, that has created some unintended consequences that we couldn't have foreseen. And because we've overlaid them with each other, they interact in ways that have created more unintended consequences. And our message to Coloradans is not that we need to change these policies. We are agnostic on that. Our message to Coloradans is simply be aware of how they're affecting your quality of life. Because if you look at a 35-year trend chart on any of those metrics I shared with you, you can see that we have not been able to sustain our quality of life over the last 35 years. And it is highly unlikely that we will be able to sustain our current quality of life over the next 35 years. And so each of us as Coloradans has one of 2 choices. We can either change our expectation of what we want our quality of life to be, and we need to be realistic about that, or we need to change the 3 policies that are driving that quality of life. That's the only 2 choices. And we are agnostic on what we should do. All we have done is host a statewide conversation to see what people think, to see if there's any agreement about how we should go forward. Our only interest is we don't want Coloradans to wake up in 15 or 20 years and say, gee, what happened? Why don't we fund higher ed anymore? Because if you can draw a straight line and you can look at a 35-year trend chart, you can see where we've come from, and you can likely forecast pretty closely where we are headed. So that's my spiel. And I want to entertain some questions about that on any of those policies or about our process. But I have our website up here, www.betterco.org. All the slides that I've shared here, plus a complete discussion of all three of those amendments, plus the poll that we have engaged 1,800 Coloradans in, is on that website. And you can go through and you can cast your opinion. You can see how there's a final report on there that shares all the results. And I have my email address up here as well, reeves@betterco.org. So with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you. So, question, is there any indication that there is any initiatives to actually implement any of the ideas that grew out of our statewide conversation? And so, important to recognize that we, as part of our model, when we tee up an issue for discussion, such as we did on Gallagher, Tabor, and Amendment 23, we explain the issue. It takes about 30 minutes to explain the issue. And then the first question we ask people is, are you okay with the way it's working? And we tell people, if a majority of people in this room are okay with it, we're going to move on to the next issue, because we're not here to sell a solution to something you don't see as a problem. So the first option that we give them is do nothing, and if a majority of the people say, no, status quo isn't cutting it, then we look at a range of options. So for each of those three fiscal policies, we looked at about 5 different policy options, and we framed those options up over a year ago. One of those options, to your question, one of the options we teed up for discussion was concerning Tabor, was should we eliminate the revenue cap. Tabor requires a vote of the people to raise a tax, and it also has this revenue cap based on population inflation. Much to our surprise, your legislature took that idea and referred it to your ballot this fall, and it's called Proposition CC. So the answer to the question is yes, there is an idea on the ballot to implement one of the consensus ideas that came out of our conversation. We had nothing to do with it, though. We hosted our first meeting in Grand Junction on March 27th, and I got a call from an executive committee member that said, the legislature is referring something on Tabor. So that created some issues. But that idea got 83% support amongst 1,800 community leaders in 37 communities. So they are watching that closely. Yes, sir, in the back. I don't know if you heard the question. The youth vote is being suppressed in some areas, and would our process help address that? So one of the challenges that we have when we build our list, or we don't build it, it's important to us that we don't have our fingerprints on the guest list, or the outcome will be criticized as, oh, you got what you wanted because you picked the audience. So we're very careful not to have our fingerprints on the guest list. In all 37 communities, we go to the same 6 people. We go to the mayor, we go to a county commissioner, we go to the CEO of the chamber, the CEO of the community foundation, the school superintendent, the college president. We sit them around a table and we say, in 45 minutes, how many people's names can you come up with who you think of who are constructive in this community, have influence in this community, and who collectively look like the community? And we share with them a series of pie charts from the state demographer's office and the Secretary of State that shows what their community actually looks like, politically, age, gender, profession, ethnicity. And as they suggest names, we push them to estimate those demographics on each of their candidates, and we enter that, and then it populates a row of pie charts underneath it, so they can see, is the audience you're building actually looking like your community? And maybe you wouldn't be surprised. I was surprised how community leaders often don't know what their community looks like, and so it's very helpful to push them and go, oh yeah, I think we do have a Latino here. But so to your question. The 2 demographics that we struggled to always get at the table was, one, youth, in part because those established community leaders don't hang with youth very much, right? So they're struggling to come up with names. And the other thing is that's not how the under 30 crowd really engages. They don't like to come and sit in a room for 2 hours and talk about public policy. I don't get it. I think there's nothing funner than doing that. So we undershot youth representation, and we have looked that we probably need to take the conversation to the youth. We probably need to take it to all the colleges and engage that. The other ethnic group, or the other group that we undershot in our meetings was ethnic minorities. And it had more, not because we didn't invite them, it's just there's a cultural divide there. And the best example I can give is in the San Luis Valley. We had a meeting in Alamosa. That group of community leaders built a guest list of about 250 people, 47% Hispanic, as it should be. Only 17% of the people that showed up were Hispanic. And I've learned since then, I think I'm learning that similar to how you engage youth, if you want to engage that ethnic minority, you have to take the conversation to them. Don't ask them to come to your conversation. So we're learning as we go, and hopefully this model could help contribute to that. Yes?
Great. So a couple questions. One is, have you considered electronic democracy to draw those more social media-oriented groups? And also the gender. Are you finding the gender balance equal or lopsided on one side or the other? And the final question is, since there's so much gridlock and turmoil happening in Washington, D.C., do you see what you're doing not only replicated here in Colorado, but in the other 49 states? And do you see a trend toward local, because decision-making might be more streamlined ultimately in the future than it would be in Washington? Do you see a trend back toward local, regional, bioregional?
What was your question again? Let me remember those. I'm going to ask you the electronic one first.
Yeah, electronic democracy.
Okay. So we have not. So you can go online on that website, and you can participate in the polling. So that's electronic. We keep that data separate because one of the challenges that is really frayed at our public debate across the country is that it's being conducted over a cell phone or electronic, and it's not face-to-face. And so central to our model is you come to a meeting, you sit at a table with your neighbor, and you talk. And it's a very different quality of conversation and a very different outcome opposed if you can sit behind a curtain and just do it on your phone. So we haven't done it for that deliberate reason. That said, we are missing the youth demographic because that's how they communicate. And so we are exploring opportunities in the next one to maybe use Skype or something, try and get some kind of face-to-face without eroding that personal touch. And what was your other question? Yes, please. Well, and our focus is purely on state policy, not local or federal. What we have seen, very encouraging, is that when people use those remote voting devices, so when they cast their opinion on an option, it appears on the screen in real time. And there are many times, there are audible gasps in the room when they realize, oh my gosh, we agreed. We have seen communities that have come together on others. This has spurred other community conversations when people realize, well, I've known you for 20 years in our community just as a gadfly or as an opponent, and my gosh, we agree. And it has really brought communities together in many respects that they have played off of. So that's been encouraging. Could it be replicated nationally? We've been pushed that we should take this further. We're just trying to get our training wheels on right now. But I think it could. It's very inspiring. When you see the levels of agreement, the gentleman asked about what grew out of this year's conversation that's on the ballot, which, and those were two separate efforts, but it's the most popular idea out of our statewide conversation is on the ballot. It's very encouraging to see 83% of Coloradans get behind something, and in that we look at crosstabs. The clickers allow people to vote anonymously, which is key to this model. If you ask a group of community leaders on a public policy issue to raise their hand, forget that. I mean, the first thing they'll do is look around and see who's in the room, and then they'll vote based on who's in the room, right? And so the clickers allow anonymity, but we do ask those demographic questions so we know how Democrats versus Republicans, ethnic difference, age difference. And so in our statewide conversation, 2/3 of Republicans supported that idea as well. So, and yet only...
Thank you, Reeves.
Yes, okay.
You've given us a lot
That's the hook. Thank you very much.
You've given us a lot to think about. You've showed us the big picture of how things connect in our fiscal policy and conflict with each other. And I think you have challenged us as community leaders, as we are in this club, to be involved. So on your behalf, it is our pleasure to contribute 100 doses of vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund in your name. Thank you.